I was going to say, this is like the best problem to ever have, is that there's too much conversation in the room right now, and too much people meeting each other. I love it. So we're going to shift now to bringing Yeshi here to talk to us, and we're so excited. Let me do a little lovely intro for you. Milner is the founder and executive director of Data for Black Lives. She has worked since she was 17 behind the scenes. Oh, wait, let me put this beautiful picture up here. Yes. So she was 17 behind the scenes as a movement builder, technologist, data scientist on a number of campaigns. She started Data for Black Lives because for too long she straddled the worlds of data and organizing and was determined to break down the silos to harness the power of data. And so, I can do it. Thank you. Oh, thanks.
I was hogging it.
Yeah, we have one, so we're sharing. Determined to break down the silos to harness the power of data to make change in the lives of Black people. In 2 years, Data for Black Lives has raised over $2 million, hosted 2 sold-out conferences at the MIT Media Lab, and has changed the conversation around big data and technology across the U.S. and globally. As a founder of Data for Black Lives, her work has received much acclaim. Yeshi is an echoing Green Black Male Achievement Fellow and holds the founders of Black Lives and joins the founders of Black Lives Matter and Occupy Wall Street in the distinguished inaugural class of Roddenberry Foundation Fellows. Yeah, she has a bachelor's from Brown University, some good Brown alum here, and serves on the board of the historic Highlander Center for Research and Education. I am so glad to welcome Yeshi, who will be talking for about 45 minutes, and then we will be doing some questions.
Thank you so much. I'm loud already, so reclick this. Welcome, everybody. Can you hear me? Yeah. Okay, great. I'm so excited and happy to be here. When Michelle reached out to speak, I was like, yes, of course, this is a no-brainer. And I think for a lot of different reasons, right? A lot of our movement, right, 4,000 scientists and activists identify as LGBTQ, as well as more than half of our staff. And this is also a gap, not just in the field in general of data science and big data, but in our movement. How do we empower folks to actually do this kind of research, where they study, where they work, and continue to kind of push the conversation around the role that data can play in the lives of the most vulnerable people. So I'm going to talk a little bit about my story. This is how I always start. And then I'm going to go into some history, right? Because I never talk about algorithms or big data or anything until I kind of give some historical groundwork. It's not a whole complete history, but hopefully we can set a basis for it. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about what an algorithm is, how we define predictive analytics, how we think about big data. I think, sent in to Kate a kind of manifesto that I wrote for our last conference, which is a call to action to abolish big data. That's very intentional language because applying the practices and traditions of the abolitionist movement, the movement to abolish slavery, as well as the movement to abolish prisons, to the practices around big data, right? How do we take the power of big data out of the hands of a few people and put it in the hands of people who need it the most, right? It's not getting rid of data, but it's using it differently, thinking about it differently. So I'll talk a bit about how we're thinking about data, but also some of the algorithms and ways in which data is being weaponized that we're addressing in our movement. I'll talk about Data for Black Lives and also kind of give a call to action because I'm here as well to speak and to share about our work, but to really learn from you all. I already learned so much from this earlier discussion and to really recruit, right? I want everybody here to be involved with Data for Black Lives in some way. So that's really an invitation. So, I started Data for Black Lives. Click it? Oh, okay. Yeah, I started Data for Black Lives about 2 years ago, but really it started for me in high school. I was 17 years old, and some young people at a neighboring school actually had organized a peaceful protest. And this was because a vice principal, high school administration, had put a student in a headlock, right? And this was 2007, 2008. before, you know, a lot of the mainstream media attention that we have around police brutality, and certainly there was no attention to what was going on in schools, right? We also had cell phone video footage, but it was very grainy, you know, but instead of these young people kind of being recognized as being leaders, and thankfully in the way that folks are being encouraged at schools to walk out, to make demands on school administration, but also around things like gun violence, that did not happen, right? At this predominantly Black, predominantly immigrant school, what the school administration and the school district decided to do, instead of recognizing these young people's leadership, was to send in SWAT teams, police cars. And I will never forget being at home and watching on the news, CNN, right? The headline saying students riot at Miami Edison Senior High School. And literally seeing like kids that I went to like elementary school with being slammed against police cars, being arrested. And there's like still video online of this if you go on YouTube. Sometimes I show the video depending on the audience, but it's really traumatizing watching that kind of state violence play out against young people who really had the best intentions. So that really triggered something in me where I was like, wow, unless we found different ways of expressing our voice, and you know, pushing back against these systems, our lives would continue to be under assault, right? So we tried protests. You know, I got involved with Power Center for Social Change, which is a youth organization in Miami. And we would also go to school board meetings, right? We would sign up for like a public hearing every Wednesday to talk to our school board. Like we would do our 2-minute, you know, speeches, and I would, you know, have my little speech, whatever. And oftentimes, like we would be totally ignored, we'd be kicked out of these meetings, right? So all these kind of traditional channels of activism and protest were not working until we really saw what if data could be protest, right? What would it look like for us to survey young people about their experiences with suspensions and arrests in schools, right? And we hit the ground running. We collected over 600 surveys. Very simple. I mean, none of this was like cognitive tested and all the other stuff that we do now. It was like, but it was valid, okay? But, you know, but very simple, but, you know, just in the process of doing that data collection as a high school student, it was amazing how, for the first time, it was clear that these young people had even been asked about their choice. It's like, oh, okay, me getting suspended for not having my school ID doesn't make me a bad kid. Right? This is part of a citywide problem, a statewide problem, and a national problem. And it's called the school-to-prison pipeline. And, you know, there's a group and there's people who are working on solutions, right? And this solution was, at that point, restorative justice. So we actually turned all those findings into a comic book. And even though it took us years to even get on the radar of, like, the school board and implement restorative justice in our schools, actually around the time when the Obama administration had done that whole, you know, release of all the civil rights data through the Office of Civil Rights around school disparities, even though it took us forever to actually move our decision makers, we were learning that young people from all over the country were actually using our comic book. People in Denver, in New Orleans, in Oakland. Yesterday, someone told me that in Knoxville, Tennessee, they had used our comic book because A, they were experiencing the same things, and B, there was no existing data to really back up what they were experiencing in schools, right? So that was kind of my introduction to data, but it also really kind of taught me, you know, it had me think, you know, I graduated from high school, and I actually went to Brown, and I guess there's something in the water at Brown where, you know, very interdisciplinary, but also very active, where, you know, my commitment was to just get as much research skills as possible. You know, I had advisors in the econ department. Actually, one of my advisors was Don Operario, whose research is on MSM groups, right? So he was like my number one advocate in me, like, trying to get into, like, you know, like these higher level qualitative methods classes, and all with the focus of bringing it back to Miami, right? Why? Because I knew that the only way that we can challenge not just these policies, but was by also challenging some of these narratives, right? And it took me a while to learn that what made it so that instead of these young people's activism being recognized and being nurtured, why were we being met with police violence, right? Why were we being met with violence? And I realized that it really has historical roots, you know, and I always talk about risk because in addition to my experiences in high school, I remember the first time in elementary school I ever heard the term at risk, right? I was in a computer lab with some other students, of course, And this young woman said, she said, we were like 9 years old, and she was like, oh, I'm at risk, and you are too. I said, oh, that's interesting. Like, at risk of what? I was so scared. I was like, what's going on? And then she said, I'm a part of an after-school program, and it's for at-risk youth, and the program's great, but it's for kids who, might get pregnant at an early age, might be incarcerated, whatever. So I realized how, wow, like, this was an identity that, young people like me had already kind of internalized and adopted. And it came with also, I'm sure the program was great. I'm sure the people who did it had the best intentions. But when we think about the word risk, which comes up a lot in big data, and I know in a different way in health research, how do we continue to like problematize this? And what are the historical kind of roots of this term risk? And one of my favorite examples of machine learning is, synonyms. It helps you write. So when you look up most useful ways, So, when we think of risk, danger, jeopardy, peril, hazard, menace to society, threat, right. But then there's also possibility, chance, gamble, probability, right? But those top words are the ones that are really, unfortunately, used to describe youth of color and increasingly LGBTQ youth as well. These are identities that are put onto us, right? Sometimes even, by well-meaning folks who want to do the work, who want to support, right? And that's why I love the language around vulnerable populations more, because I think that really, again, doesn't put the onus of risk on individuals, but on the systems. So we'll talk more about that too. So like more historical background, right? During the last election, there was a lot around super predators, but I think there was a missed opportunity to have a conversation around not just how that term came about, but also, how do we kind of, again, abolish it as well, right? Because even though most people aren't really saying super predators anymore, this is an ethos. This is a narrative that is persistent, and it's been embedded in policies. But where does it even come from, right? It comes from a social scientist, John DiIulio, who worked as part of the Bush administration, decided that, the way that we were going to describe crime and the way that we were going to think about, the coming changes demographically in our country was to characterize young people of color, especially Black youth, as super predators. And this was based on quack, crazy, mythical research, right? So this is an article where actually, years later, I guess he became Catholic and confessed that none of this was really based on any research. But I think in another slide I have some notes on what he means. So DiIulio created a whole theory around the notion that a new generation of street criminals is upon us. The youngest, biggest, and baddest generation any society has ever known. Based on all that we've witnessed, researched and heard from young people who are close to the action, he wrote, this is in a peer-reviewed journal article, right? Here's what we believe. America is now home to thickening ranks of juvenile super predators, radically impulsive, this language is crazy, brutally remorseless youngsters, including ever more pre-teenage boys who murder, assault, rob, burglarize, deal deadly drugs, gun-toting gangs, and create communal disorders, right? And at the core, the problem is that inner city children grow up surrounded by teenagers and adults who are themselves deviant, delinquent, or criminal, right? So even though he kind of, retracted this, it was already too late. The cat was out the bag. This became the narrative that, informed the creation of policy that justified mass incarceration and also really, was the basis for the kind of, exclusionary disciplinary policies that, affected my life and the lives of the young people who I went to school with, right? And so there's a couple of other myths that, were very, very prominent at that time as well, right? So, this is New York Times did these retro reports where they went back on different research and talked about how it was wrong or whatever. But, I remember even being at Brown and hearing about the whole crack baby myth. And it wasn't until this article came out in 2013 that people realized, first of all, this myth, which again informed social policy, like targeted people, criminalized people, undermined people's survival and livelihood, was based on a study of 23 participants. So the researchers in here, like, that's like seriously, like 23, and the folks who actually followed up with some of the study participants, and they actually, one of the girls, she was the first in her family to graduate from college. She had overcome all these barriers, and they showed that less than race, less than all these other factors, poverty, right? These systemic factors were the reason why young people ended up becoming, having worse outcomes. And again, it was this narrative of these people are going to be a burden on society, right? So all of these things were at play. There's some other ones. The welfare queen, I think this comes up a lot too, not just in thinking about, social services to certain populations, but how we even think about, like, right now, the conversation around Medicare, the conversation about Medicaid, Social Security benefits, like, how are we actually, dividing resources and allocating resources to the folks who need it the most. But again, Ronald Reagan in 1976, this is going a little bit back, but this is persistent still, talks about, a black mom who, was kind of like manipulating the system for $150,000 a year. If anybody's making that much from the U.S. government, it's not because they're fighting for programs. Like, So, but when this was something that I came up against a lot too when I went back to Miami after Brown. I graduated, I had all my skills, all my training, and I was asked to work on a campaign around Black infant mortality. And even just trying to get the hospitals to recognize the ways in which their policies, overuse of C-section, just racist bedside care, aggressive targeting and marketing of infant formula, they didn't want to hear from low-income moms, until we collected our own data, but I'll talk about that later. So, this is heavy stuff. This is like real serious stuff. But it's also the reality that people are experiencing. And, I bring up this last quote because, on top of all these other narratives, on top of, the super predator and the welfare queen and the ways in which, for Black people and people of color, we're being criminalized through narratives that are then embedded into policy, whose lives are actually at the most risk, right? And I think we're in Stonewall Room, and I love that we're here because, when we think about all Black lives, we're saying all Black lives, right? And we're talking about folks like Marsha P. Johnson, who around the same time, a lot of these myths were actually kind of, was found dead, right? And no clue around her murder or what happened, but, how did these conditions make it so that someone who is an icon now, right, who we really, really kind of glorify, couldn't even survive, right? So this is a quote from actually a trans faith leader, Lewis Mitchell. When you have a combination of a society that protects racism, misogyny, and transphobia, it creates insurmountable odds, right? So that's a lot. That was some history, but that was a lot, right? Where do we go from here? What does this have to do with big data? And the reason why I always kind of create this basis is because in the age of big data, if we are not aware of this history, we risk repeating it. And that's an appropriate use of the word risk, I think. We risk repeating it, right? We have to problematize. We have to go back. Most of my job nowadays for Black Lives Founder is doing these amazing talks and meeting you all. It's, thinking about how we can work creatively with intelligent machines and with data to solve problems, but it's also reading and rereading and re-researching a lot of history because we're just seeing stuff playing out over and over again. So now we can talk about what an algorithm is, right? Now we can talk about the ways in which these histories and values are embedded, right? A lot of times the conversation is what kind of input data do we use, right? But how are these histories and values embedded into what we call the objective function? Whenever we're thinking about a model and developing one, and folks know all about this here too, the first question is what are we trying to optimize for, right? What are we trying to learn? What are we trying to optimize through this model? We have our input, which is data, whatever form it is. We have our algorithm, and I have a black box there on purpose because a lot of times the algorithms that we're interacting with and that we're coming across are totally proprietary. We can't get under the hood. It would take a legal strategy and a whole gang of lawyers to even get the FICO algorithm. Trust me, we're trying. The car insurance payment algorithms. But this is a black box process that I think Michelle said really, really well, that it has, like, so many of our vulnerable communities are at the mercy of, right? Because maybe it's not a Netflix recommendation. Sure, sometimes I can't find anything to watch on Netflix. But, when I'm going to apply for housing, and I'm being told that a 3-digit score is the reason why I have to, I might even be homeless. Like, that's real, So we have our histories and values, and oftentimes this is where they're baked in, as well as being baked into the input data, right? So we can talk about some more examples now, but this is a kind of a diagram that we came up with. And we're going to save questions and answers for later, but if anybody has any questions now, before I go on, just about what an algorithm is and what predictive analytics is. So, transfixed. Okay, so when we're talking about inputs, right, one of the things that we often use as researchers is zip code, right? And I think zip code is really important, but we also have to know the history behind zip code, right? Zip code was created, I think, in the 1930s or earlier. Won't be on that. In order to reorganize our country, in order to help delivering mail better, right? Mm-hmm. So, but if you lay that on the history of our country, which was created by segregation, zip codes have a new meaning, right? So this is actually the 1933 Homeowners Loan Corporation, right? This is a program out of the New Deal. So when we talk about the New Deal, we have to be real about the history behind it, where certain parts of the cities, this is Miami, by the way, my hometown, were characterized as being best and given like an A grade, and D, or hazardous, right? And it's crazy because how the ways in which this characterization not just informed the decisions that they were making in 1933 about how to build a city or how to reorganize it, but even to this day. Why? Because people who were in hazardous zones were subject to redlining, right? They were subject to being denied loans, being denied opportunities to own their homes, being restricted from owning homes in areas that were best. And later on, this was used as a way to restrict other forms of resources, right? So when you look at this map of Miami, I wish I had another map that could also show, where we have the worst, the worst funded schools, right? Where there's the worst infrastructure, right? It's identical. And so how does zip code become a proxy for race? It becomes a proxy for race when we live in a rigidly segregated society that was created by government to be rigid and segregated. And we have a number, zip codes like 6, 7 digits, that actually embody that, right? So you don't even have to put black or white or whatever. You can just put zip code, because usually the way that this world has been organized, and even today, even though with gentrification folks are moving around, zip code can still predict for race, right? So why does this matter? What do we do about this? Why, is it a bad thing? Is it a good thing that zip codes are proxy for race? It's a bad thing in the context of data being weaponized, right? So it's funny because I always use this example, and now we're in Chicago, so here we go. But this was a really great report that folks at ProPublica did, where they went under the hood of some car insurance algorithms, and they were able to use some deep investigation to look at, and investigate, really why was it that someone who lived in this area of Chicago had, maybe had significantly less car insurance payments than someone who lived on the South Side. And I really encourage folks to read this article, because I like how they brought in people's stories. One young man from the South Side, hardworking single father, and paying $300 a month for car insurance is a huge, 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 huge burden, especially since you're already working. You're limited to low-wage work opportunities, and it's cheaper just to not have a car. But when you have kids, when you have whatever, I don't know how it is to labor, but it seems like you may or may not need a car depending on where you live. Why was it that people like him and people in areas which were more lower income, more working class, but families And when you actually look at the crime data, we're less crime than out here, where shops and commercial areas, we're paying significantly less, right? And then you go back and you compare the maps. This is the 1933 Homeowners Corporation map. And this is the map that shows where the higher difference between premium and risk for car insurance. And this is, you kind of can't see the actual breakdown for how much, but it's almost identical, right, in terms of where people are actually having to pay more. And I wish I had one that can kind of go deeper and show it specifically in Chicago what the breakdown is. But they have a ton of data, and I really recommend you guys looking at it. But again, one of the things that they identified was that even though these car insurance companies were not using Black or white or Native or Latinx, they were using zip code as a way to be a proxy for race. And I mean, growing up in Miami, I was always told that if you wanted to get the lowest car insurance payments, use a zip code from Miami Beach. Don't use it from North Miami, That's common knowledge. But, how do the ways in which these narratives then become policy, and then this policy becomes codified into data, and then the ways in which through big data we're scaling up and we're amplifying existing injustice, right? So this is just one example as well. And this is another one. So these are risk assessments, and it was really exciting in the beginning of last year, where a lot of folks on the ground and in different communities were really mobilizing and organizing to end cash bail, which is a really important fight. But then we saw some presidential candidates and some folks being like, okay, the solution is risk assessment, pretrial risk assessments. And that's not the solution, because, again, how are these risk assessments developed? Who's developing them? Private companies. So these are some questions from risk assessments developed by a company called Compass. Private company, that's the trend here. A lot of these companies are private for-profit companies, too, that are developing these models. So there's a connection between big data and privatization, too. So, so let's say, okay, I'll ask you guys a question. So how many of your friends or acquaintances have ever been arrested? First, raise your hand. Okay, right. So,
they in there right now?
Right. How often have you moved in the last 12 months? You don't have to raise your hand, but were you ever suspended or expelled from school? How often do you feel bored? That's a question. How often do you feel bored? And, right, I don't know. The options are never, several times a month, several times a week, daily. I mean, depends on what I'm doing. And then this one is even crazier. A hungry person has a right to steal. Strongly disagree not. What are you guys actually asking about? What data are you trying to collect? And it's crazy because when we see this play out, who's actually getting assigned longer sentences? Because the whole point of this is to determine sentencing. And again, ProPublica and other researchers increasingly were able to identify through going in and doing that deep work that, a 15-year-old girl with no prior convictions, 15-year-old Black girl, was getting sentenced longer than a white career criminal, right? Because of this. I mean, honestly, according to this, I should be in jail right now. I've been suspended many times in school for dumb reasons. Just this year, I moved 1 million times just doing this work. I'm not really that bored often because this is a cool job. But I think a hungry person has a right to steal. I don't know, depending on the store, especially Whole Foods. But from the hot and cold bar, okay? And how about the sales? Right, how many of your friends, come on, it's embedded in these questions, and therefore the data collection is so much bias. And the crazy thing is, people's lives are really being affected and changed by this. So many states are using pretrial risk assessments. We literally have presidential candidates that are pushing for this right now. So that's really crazy. So actually, this is another example. So recently, some med students from Harvard Medical School, really, really cool group of young people. They have a whole coalition fighting against racism. That's not the name of it, but Coalition Against Racism, and they were really involved with worker rights stuff happening at Harvard Med School. And they've been really, really active in thinking about how do we challenge the use of risk assessment in medicine. And it's so funny that I'm speaking here because this is a risk assessment that was actually developed by an OBGYN right here at Northwestern, Dr. Grotman. If he knows, if he's here, and anybody knows him, yeah, right? I may be on live stream, but it's really crazy because, first of all, right, like, so some background. I don't know if folks know about, with OBGYN related issues, whatever, but, people who give birth, let's be real, like, let's be intentional about our language too. People who give birth, and who have had a C-section, right, usually, and especially according to these calculators, are more likely to have a vaginal or traditional birth right after, right? And that poses a lot of complications because that's major surgery. It can have long-lasting health problems. And going back to my example, of my story, I graduated from Brown, and I was asked to come back to Power U, but this time to work on something very different from the school to prison pipeline work, but to work on Black infant mortality issues. And it was a situation of, no one knew why, Black moms and Black people who gave birth were, way more likely to go into the hospital and leave with complications, and sometimes not even survive. And babies would go in to give birth, and their babies would not survive before their first year. Actually, babies were three times more likely to die before their first birthday than white babies. And that was a disparity that has been persistent since the 1950s, even though nationally the infant mortality rate has decreased across the board in this country. So that's crazy. One of the things that we realized, and that's just working with moms and other Black people who give birth in Miami, was that the overuse of C-section. Our hospital, the largest public hospital in the country, Jackson, had a practice really of giving out C-sections versus like allowing people to push and to give birth naturally, right? Part of that was due to like policies around discharge before noon. You want to free up hospital beds. Part of that was just due to the fact that it's more expensive to insurance and Medicaid, and therefore more profitable to give a major surgery, right? And who are the folks who are actually getting C-sections? 80% of the women that we surveyed, because we did a survey surveying 300 moms about their experiences giving birth, and overwhelmingly people said that they got C-section even without, even wanting to have a traditional birth. And so you think about this context and you look at this risk calculator. So this was developed to help health professionals decide on, who is going to have a successful VBAC, right? And what is interesting is that the whole point of this is correcting for race, even though the study that grounds this study, this risk calculator, had other factors that included type of insurance, marital status, like other kind of neighborhood indicators. But instead of even looking at those other ones, they chose race. And it's interesting because, so here's how it works. Like you put in BMI, age, and then you put in race, right? So there's only it's either are you African American or are you Hispanic, right? So again, we're thinking around like how are we centering, white identities versus non-white identities as well, too. So, you put in all this different stuff and then it should calculate, right? So I put in my age and then I didn't add it much else, but that's not gonna make sense. And then you see, right, so for a white person that's no Hispanic, the chance of success is 75%. Versus if you're Black, it's 61%, right? So this risk calculator is not really correcting for race as much as it's subtracting based on race. And what are the implications for this, right? In Boston, where Darshali and some of these other students are actually been organizing to end the use of this, they were seeing that, the most vulnerable populations, homeless moms and people who give birth, are getting C-sections without the post-surgical care, right? Without a home, People were dying from these procedures because they're major invasive procedures, right? And I think, the most troubling thing is that, Dr. Roman, I don't know his name is W, right? But, why at this time are we really still treating race as this biological construct versus a social construct, right? Why are we, this is also not just based on the study that they did, it also really has roots in some of this like eugenics and like pelvic size, like all of this history that's like really crazy, and I thought was already thrown out, but it's so crazy that there's researchers, and this guy's a leading, I'm telling you, the OBGYN right here, leading person leading expert in the field, right? And I can talk more about how we've been working with these groups and other med students and doctors to challenge the use of these risk assessments, as well as kidney function algorithms, which are race-based, as well as blood pressure algorithms, which are race-based. But, it's amazing because Darcy and these folks, they reached out to him, and he was like, it's inflammatory, you're wrong, very offensive. And then they also wrote amazing articles that I'll try to put up and show. I don't have a slide for it. And they tried to submit it to different journals. And they were rejected by all like the major journals, right? They finally got accepted to one, but it's amazing how even just trying to bring this up, they've gotten so much pushback. But, the reason why they keep going is because as doctors, as health professionals, they see the impact of these calculators, right? This doesn't make any sense. So, my next slide, okay. So yeah, let's talk, how do we see race as a social construct rather than a biological one, right? How do we reject research or challenge these notions as they're being not just embedded into the day-to-day practices of medicine, but in the data that guides and builds the field day to day, right? And I think too, it's also pushing us to think that maybe race is not a risk factor. Racism is, right? And we talked about this earlier. Black men who have sex with men are doing everything right. Why are they still the most vulnerable for HIV/AIDS? Maybe we need to focus on and shift the onus to homophobia and transphobia. How do we take the lens from individual people's actions and activities and identities? Remember, we talked about the history of people being criminalized and shift it to these systems. These systematic, ways in which practices, policies, written and unwritten rules that surround people's lives are actually the things that's killing them, right? Let's stop criminalizing people's identities. And let's not, amplify it through data. So that was really a lot. I hope you guys are got it, whatever. But there's hope, we're working on it, right? At Data for Black Lives, we believe that data as protest. How do we reclaim data, right? How do we, yes, take the time to expose and to problematize and to challenge and address these sort of negative uses of data, but also how do we build the structures and the opportunities and the collaborations and raise the money that's honestly needed for us to create our own data and for us to create our own software in our own ways and our own applications of research, right? And also because the truth is some narratives were created by data and they can only be disrupted by data. And like I said, for my story, data is a form of protest when all other channels are blocked, right? We could not, bring 300 people who give birth into the meeting with us when we finally met with the hospital, after them ignoring us and all this other stuff, but they could not deny the data that we collected. They couldn't, right? And so as a result of us collecting 300 surveys, I wrote a report called A Call for Birth Justice in Miami. We only got one Miami Herald article, but that was enough, right? Because I realized that hospitals, their bread and butter is also reputation too. So we were able to get this sweeping policy passed where they totally transformed the maternal and child health ward. And to this day, these policies are in place that are protecting the lives of moms and babies. But most importantly, I remember being in the meeting with them and them telling me, whenever we're going to implement something new, whenever we're going to introduce a new policy, we're going to go to the community first. That was the big victory for me, right? The policy was great, but that was the big victory for me, a mindset change that was necessary. So we also believe in data as accountability. So earlier this year, we had a whole Facebook campaign that we had launched, and I love the conversation earlier about the ways in which through big data, these social media platforms are able to, really do some kind of scary and just awful stuff that is resonant of historical examples of the ways in which research has been violence against our communities, right? So I was actually working on an application for this whole Facebook Community Leaders program. I'll tell you guys a real story. And then I was writing the application because all of these people told me to apply, David Black Guys, you guys should be a part of this Facebook Community Leaders thing. I was like, okay, sure. And then I'm writing the application, and I realized stuff that I was saying, based on conversations that I had with our movement, needed to be public. So instead of applying for the funding, I wrote an open letter to Facebook on behalf of the Data for Black Lives movement, right? And we had 3 demands. Commit anonymized Facebook data to a public data trust. Work with technologists, advocates, and ethicists to establish a data code of ethics. Hire Black data scientists and research scientists. And yes, and all of this, especially this one about code of ethics, right? Facebook, you go on research.facebook.com, they're doing whole peer review type research, but there's no IRB. There's they have their own internal IRB. But I mean, when you have the data of over 2.1 billion users, and you're using it, to influence elections and to that has been right now that has been, undermining and just the civil and human rights of people in this country, we have to make bigger demands of them. So that's where the data code of ethics came in. If you guys are going to be doing research, especially what happened with Cambridge Analytica, that was large-scale survey research done without people's consent. When I went to Brown, the first thing I had to do was do my IRB approval stuff, okay? I had to go through the whole class about it. I had to learn all about the Tuskegee Airmen experiment, Henrietta Lacks. I had to learn about human subjects research. I had to, right? Why don't they have to follow those exact same rules when they do research, right? So that was our demand around code of ethics. And right now we're in a process of working with ethicists, technologists, and advocates, and invite you all as well, especially to our next conference, to continue this process. We also demanded that Facebook commit anonymized data to a public data trust. And I knew that asking Facebook for their data wasn't going to work. It's their bread and butter, they're an advertising company, their bread and butter is their data, obviously. But I made that demand on purpose because we need to think differently about who owns this data, who it belongs to, and what is the possible use for it, right? So they're able to, they have more data on natural disasters than any federal agency does. They have more data on it, whether it's influenza, whether it's any kind of, HIV, but they have more access to data. And they know they do. Go on research.facebook.com, they have some of their research on there, but I know Facebook researchers who are a part of our movement who give me intel and tell me the kind of findings and the kind of questions they're posing and what they're really using this data for. What would it look like for folks from our movement, for folks here in this room, right? How could your research be improved by having access to a testing environment like Facebook or having access to this data? And I bet you would do way more better things than Alexander Kogan and Christopher Wiley with that same data, right? What they did was got Trump elected. Okay? Let's talk about it. So for me, it was sure, we want to fight Facebook, we want to go against Mark Zuckerberg, but it was really about how do we offer an alternative understanding of the role that data plays in society and the kind of standards that we need to be putting on these big tech companies, right? And we got a response from Facebook. We've been a part of this whole civil rights audit. We've been working with folks at Facebook Public Policy. But most importantly, I'm an organizer. We took this Facebook letter to Congress, right? We met with people in Congress. We said, we thank people, but also kind of shame people for the kind of questions they asked during the Zuckerberg hearings, which if you guys saw that, it was a hot mess. It really was. I was what? And we were able, we literally took the letter, and I saw the lack of information on the Hill and the lack of algorithmic literacy and data literacy as an opportunity for our movement, right? Okay, we're all at the same page. And the way that I'm describing FICO credit scores and all that other stuff to folks in Congress, elected officials, is the same way I'm describing it to my grandma, but she understands it better because she's a part of it because she's directly impacted. So I'm not Cory Booker. I'm not really a huge fan, but his staffers are great, and they, for example, took our demands and actually signed on to them and sent their own letter to Zuckerberg. And some next steps that happened from this was, again, my focus was never to really fight Facebook. I actually care more about our communities and investing there than confronting them. But through building this relationship, through having our own set of demands, right, we were also able to get in a place where anytime something comes up, whether it's Facebook or facial recognition technology or whatever, they call us. They ask our movement for support, not the lobbyists, not the Facebook public policy people. They call us, right? So this was a big win because it also resulted in Booker and Yvette Clarke's office, who is part of the House, in creating the first Algorithmic Accountability Act, which is a way for us to federally make sure that algorithms, whether it's newsfeed algorithms, social services algorithms, FICO, car insurance, are automated and are investigated for bias, right? So that really opens up a whole other conversation around what states, what government, but also how do we empower researchers and community as well. So another thing that we're working on is this idea of equity or warning labels for algorithms, right? So many people that we know, my family, like me sometimes, like, don't even know that we're even experiencing an algorithm, much less how much power it really does have over their lives. How answering the question one way or the other way, right? In Virginia Eubank's book, she talks a lot about this, right? I've worked with, I presented this same kind of presentation to folks at the Annie Casey Foundation, people who are on the ground working in social service organizations, foster care agencies. And when I told them the idea of the Warning Labels Project, we're not ready yet. It's not prime time yet. We're still developing, and I also invite folks who are interested in working on this to please let me know. But they were like, wow, I wish I had something like this for our clients, right? People who are signing up for food stamps, for childcare subsidies, that they knew that, again, whatever input they put in this questionnaire that seems like very simple could really could mean the difference between them getting benefits or not, right? And I think it also goes for, yes, the Facebook newsfeed and the Google search, but one of the things we're also seeing a lot of is child welfare algorithms, FICO credit score, health insurance. Here in Chicago, a lot of predictive policing stuff. Yes, let's talk about Crime Lab. So right, how do we? There's a lot of researchers who are doing an amazing job of auditing algorithms from companies, but how do we provide that information again to people, to everyday people who don't have access to this and who are honestly being deceived? Another thing, there's all this about FaceApp and people are getting okay, I believe that we should definitely educate people, but I hate how the conversation is shaming people for why are you using FaceApp? You should know better. I'm like, no, the onus needs to be on these companies for their deceptive, manipulative, and just creepy data collection policies. We can't shame people. We have to again shift it. It's not individuals onto systems, right? How do we educate our folks? So I haven't done it because I don't want to scare myself and see myself looking old, but seriously, so even amongst researchers, I'm seeing people AI people who are oh, haha, all the people who would shame old people for all these crazy phone calls, deck stuff are now doing FaceApp. I'm like, what? You can't I think that's classist. I think that's racist. I think that's a wrong lens. But the truth is, not many people know. This is intentionally obscured for a reason, for the purpose of concentrating power and resources. Right? That's how we need to abolish big data. Okay. So this is an example of one of the kind of very. This is a very early. We have a more advanced one that's not just whatever. Of how we're thinking about this labeling. We want to go against numbers and scores because again, that has a whole history. But so how do people understand, based on these categories, is this a fair process? Is this a fair outcome? What are the kind of questions we should be asking when we're auditing an algorithm? And I had a whole list of questions, but I don't think I have them here. Yeah. So does the tool, increase? Does the algorithm or does the model increase the self-determination and agency of data subjects? Would the tool be tolerated if we use it on rich white men? What is the historical context for the outcome variable? How stable is it? How agreed upon is it? Who is the data controller from the company? And who is taking outward-facing community responsibility within government agency responsibility? So that's an example for the child welfare algorithm, but I'm not going to talk about today, but we can talk about later. But under what political circumstances is the procurement decision happening. So the data collection decision happening. And there's other questions that we've been able to work with a team of folks from our movement of data scientists, researchers, but also, of course, activists and organizers to kind of expand this process. And hopefully by the next conference, we'll be able to debut our warning labels and are interested here in different local contexts how we can implement. We hope to actually implement in New York City through this new automated decision-making task force, but that's the thing, right? We have the research, but we need the advocacy to do the implementation and actually have it reach people. So that's another thing. So data as collective action, right? So, this is a story. I was just in St. Paul, Minneapolis, and that's me right there. I was just in St. Paul because, again, going back to this risk ratio thing, right? I got a call from organizers there, and this is how usually my job works. Like people call me and they're like, oh, we're like, immigration lawyers in Miami, we have all this ICE data. I didn't ask them how they got the data, but we have all this ICE data, and we need, we're so busy litigating, like we need, stopping people from getting deported, we need help in pulling analysis to get funding or to just to raise consciousness, whatever they were using it for. So my job was just to connect them with the data scientists. But in this case, they called me and they're like, yeah, there's something that's coming down the pipeline in St. Paul, and we're really worried about it, but we just don't even know what it is, right? So what was happening was that Ramsey County Sheriff's Office, the school district, the foster care agencies, the police department, all these different agencies had come together kind of really slyly and secretly to develop what was called a joint data sharing agreement for the development of risk ratios, right? Risk ratios in order to identify, young people and, other folks who were at risk, right? So we know that in the context of the school to prison pipeline, in the context of a city where Philando Castile was murdered with impunity, what that would actually mean, right? And when we're thinking about using data from school districts, if you're using suspension data to identify and target people, which here with the predictive police and stuff like that, it's already scary. Who's gonna come up, right? Who's already being suspended? So that data, right? Going back to my first slide, if that input data is already historically biased because their policies and their data collection practices are already biased. Because one thing I learned just being in Minneapolis yesterday was that it's last in the country, 50 out of 50 in terms of disparities amongst races. Why? Because there's a whole bunch of Fortune 500 companies, but then there's also a large refugee population and a large population of Native, Latinx, and Black folks who have been disenfranchised. So what did we do, right? These folks developed and organized what was called the Coalition to Stop the Cradle to Prison algorithm. I went down to St. Paul and did trainings, worked with them to just develop strategy and to think about, even at the most basic level, how through education do we empower our folks, our communities, with knowledge around algorithms, in addition to the advocacy and activism, to then change these policies. And amazingly, within only a few months, the city, the school board, and all these other folks had announced that they were dissolving the joint power sharing agreement, and actually going to go back to the solutions that folks had already been proposing, right? Which was ending suspensions, funding schools, supporting foster care youth in different ways, et cetera, et cetera. But it was a real big thing of big data zero, community one, right? We won that, and that was really, really an example of supporting our model of also really supporting local work. So, and on a national level, every year we host our Data for Black Lives conference, and that's really a space for us to, in the midst of narratives around technology being dystopic, software is eating the world, there's so much peril, there's so much threat, and there's nothing we can do. How do we go from that paranoia to power? And this is why, this is probably one of the only panels where you're going to see all Black women and gender non-conforming people talking about algorithmic accountability, right? 90% of our conference are people of color, over 80% are women and gender non-conforming people, and that's intentional, right? We have over 50 speakers, and I believe that if you can't find these folks to talk about data and these diverse voices, you're not really looking, right? So that's really been our space to think about this, and this panel was specifically about, we're the leaders that we've been looking for, organizing for algorithmic accountability, and I think it really embodies, our approach to this field, but also how we're thinking about solutions too. So, just to kind of conclude, go back to this question of what are we optimizing, right? When folks are developing models, developing algorithms, that's the question. But I ask that of myself, in this society, are we optimizing for profit? Are we optimizing, to concentrate power in one place? Are we optimizing for social control? Or are we optimizing for justice? Are we optimizing for love? Are we optimizing and really thinking about what does optimizing can also say what does success look like for us, right? How do we know this algorithm? How do we know this movement is successful, right? Okay, and it's successful if we're able to achieve a society where everyone's needs are met, And that's how we really approach the work at Data for Black Lives. Also, this is just a really pretty picture of people who came to the conference. Okay, and I want to go back to this tweet by I think an editor from one of my friends too, who when we're thinking about what are we optimizing and how we're thinking about, instead of saying race is a risk factor or someone's identity is a risk factor, how do we put the onus on systems? And I'm so excited for everybody's talk because I have so much to learn about this space. My training is partly in public health, but there's so much I can learn. And there's a big gap in our movement. We want to be able to empower folks, especially people who identify as LGBTQ, to do this kind of research that impacts their own lives, right? Because even if you're at the best institution, it's hard. You get pushback. Really thinking what is HIV prevention? How do we make it about housing and ending mass incarceration and achieving economic justice and ending school pushout, which is what I talked about with my story, addressing racism and ending queerphobia and homophobia. So I like this tweet, and also he's really funny on Twitter, so you should follow him. So yeah, I think that's it. I don't know how long I went, but I always end with an invitation for you to join our movement, right? We have a yearly conference, but one of the things that we're doing here is thinking about, since so many folks from our conference are actually from Chicago, developing and strengthening our local chapter, right? And I think too, the invitation for the rest of the day is, from here and beyond to continue this conversation, but any ideas, again, for me, that we can continue to center different voices in our movement and we can think more creatively about how do we use data, not as a weapon, but really as a tool for social change. So I'll stop there. And thank you all. I know it was time.
Just don't go too far because we're going to do a little bit of Q&A.
Okay.
But that was awesome. Thank you so much. We have some questions in the room. I know. I think we're also going to be writing a question out on Twitter that people can respond to. We're checking email. We're checking meetings. Some people in the room. How about maybe Sarah first, and then
I totally yes to all this. So, but I want to ask a question that I toy with a lot when I look at data as a activist and health equity researcher that loves data. Is the problem the data, or is it the intent and action from the data? Because I'm thinking about the school system one that you just talked about. My mom was worked in vulnerable populations as a principal outside of the Detroit area. And having some of that information in my mind was some of the things she yearned for. I need to know which kids are slipping through the cracks or might be at high risk because I don't get to see that as a principal, but I want to put things in place. But the thing is, that was her intent and her desire for action. And so I pose that question because I think data are important, and I think, and I wonder, I'd love for you to respond when I stop talking.
I'm
say, is it really more so whose hands data, who has their hands on the data, the intent of that, and then the actions that result from it?
Yeah, I think you answered it because exactly that, right? One example that I'm thinking of too is the ways in which through our movement we've been able to see the worst data sets be used positive. So for example, one of our data scientists came to the first conference, software engineer, really nerdy guy. He was like, I want to be involved with racial justice work. And then through the conference, he got connected to folks out of Florida for the Florida Rights Restoration Coalition. And they had been working for years. Over 28% of Black voters in Florida did not have the right to vote because of being formerly incarcerated. So he came on as their data director, which was amazing. And then what they were able to use were mugshot databases and criminal databases, not to recriminalize people, but to then identify the folks they need to invest in and mobilize to get others to vote yes on Amendment 4. And they passed a policy. Now it's been a whole thing to even get the state to actually allow people to restore, to get their rights back. But it was amazing how even it was just simple as that intention, right? To totally flip the script on what that data was being used for, right? And we collected our own data because, we needed to know what was happening in the schools, right? Of course the school district had their own data. They were never going to share it with us. It wasn't until the Obama administration, Office of Civil Rights, where they released, by mandate, all this school data, and we were able to disaggregate, right? Who were the most vulnerable? We were able to get information on young people with disabilities, LGBTQ, really see by all these different, what was really happening in the schools. And again, maybe traditionally that same data, before it was released to community groups, was being used to, took more funding and, kick people out of school, but, it was powerful. And that's why my whole thing around Abolish Big Data, it's a very, kind of call to action, but it's how do we think about, how do we get the data in the hands of people who will use it differently, right? People who do not have access. We talked about being a researcher and whatever. Even me, I was supposed to go get a PhD, but, Brown students, we're all over the place. But we this is my PhD, right? I realized that part of the reason why I didn't get one was because people were telling me, oh, yeah, what you're doing doesn't really, there's that department or discipline. And I was like, okay, well, now I have to make my own institution. Right? Because in order for, and I have grad students, I have folks who are wow, I'm able to do it and explore things here that I couldn't be able to, even though I am getting a PhD in math, Yep. So that was a long answer to your question, but no, you answered it, right? And I think it takes a mindset change, it takes organizing, it takes that kind of community empowerment and leadership development, which is again, for Data for Black Lives, movement building is not the most high-tech solution, but it works, right? We're seeing it work. We're seeing all these concrete policies and Facebook and all that stuff, but it really starts with empowering people. I like to say, putting a battery in people's back, right? So that wherever they go, wherever they work, they are changing internally whatever institutions they're in, and they're rethinking and having a whole kind of mindset change and personal transformation around the role of data. And it's also about imagination too, right? And creativity. Great question. Thank you. We know you're gonna ask a good question.
Oh, it's gonna happen.
Yeah. We want to say it was best last.
Yes, I was thinking, and that worries me a lot. And your example of this may fall under that aspect of things. There is this great book, The Honest Truth About Dishonesty. It talks about when some new technology or approach comes in, it gives lots of opportunities for people to run scams and kind of sell you snake oil. And I think what happens with machine learning and big data and all of this is that there are a lot of companies that are essentially selling you snake oil.
Exactly.
They go in and tell you, oh, I can have this miraculous tool that is going to save you your life or make your life easier or something like that. And what is very worrisome for me is the fact that then a lot of these things become self-fulfilling prophecies,
Yep.
right? I mean, that kid is at a high risk, so I'm going to do something to constrain him, but then this is actually just making the situation worse, and
Exactly.
it's creating. And the thing that really worries me is that people are able to go and try to sell you something, right?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, that company probably say, oh, we'll share the data, we'll give you the results, and then I'm going to sell it to anyone, to everyone else without ever having tested.
Exactly.
There is this thing, shot finder or something like that, the Chicago Police Department bought, that no one has actually tested. test the accuracy of. No one is able to get their data to test the accuracy. And anyone that has kind of tried to guess thinks that the accuracy is actually terrible. So that it doesn't do anything appropriately. So you see a way to kind of prevent people from being taken in by this kind of stuff.
Absolutely, that's a great point. And and it's crazy, like, it just took us educating people. Like, I literally did, like, a version of this presentation, and it was so helpful for them to think about what was happening differently. Not even the people who were in office who were pushing for this knew what the joint data sharing agreement was, right? They didn't understand predictive analytics. I think that there was also some behind-the-scenes financial stuff that was happening. Usually when they're rolling out some new algorithm, like, for example, actually here in Chicago, there was some controversy years ago around the use of a child welfare algorithm that alerted social workers to, again, like, the vulnerability of, like, a kid was going to die. Like, and literally they'd get an email every day saying, this kid, like, it was very alarmist, very crazy, right? So instead of them kind of using their instincts and their training as social workers, sometimes biased, sure, to actually focus in on young people who they knew from relationships and, to actually, like, support them and connect with community organizations. It was all driven by this algorithm. And the expense was that children died that year because the ones who were vulnerable, really at risk and really vulnerable, were not even coming up in this. And I think, too, when you think about that model, what data was being used? Wealthier parents aren't using social services for for like childcare, so they're using private services. They're not reflected in the data. And that's the question too. People don't ask what data is missing, right? We don't really have like crime data in this country. We have arrest data, right? And who's arrested, okay? So when you're feeding that into a model, it's going to have this output. But the craziest part was that they did some digging and they found out that the head of the social services organization, child welfare, he was part of like an LLC. Yes, it's always some LLC. Seriously, there was an LLC that owned the algorithm, and it was like a board of like 4 people, and it was this huge profit thing. And when you go back to Compass, they're a for-profit company. North Point, all these people who develop these algorithms, it all has this like kind of privatization stuff too. But it took education. Like, it was amazing how doing this presentation, doing webinars, meeting with people, asking questions, not even using the word algorithm all the time, right? Not even using the word predictive analytics. I love what you did earlier about like breaking down research, right? Because people inherently, instinctively understand things, but it's how this language is actually used to like intentionally obscure too. So it was, I would like, I'm not, I think, we need education and other forms of action, but we're at a point right now where it's gonna take us being very intentional, whether it's through labeling projects, whether it's using like we have a lot of artists that are part of this movement because we need people who can communicate, right? And can educate. And that's how people aren't duped, because I'm telling you, it's happening.
I like that presentation because it's so, like, the people in the tech sphere are never that great at it. So I feel like that's why you need partnerships.
Yeah, and we need translators too, right? Mm-hmm.
Way in the back, and then we're gonna do maybe something online. I think we have some on Twitter. Cool.
I'm Ada St. Clair, sort of representing both UChicago and Far South Community Development Corporation. One time for 305.
Okay.
So, hey, there you go, Miami-Dade. About the teaching, though, I do work with a lot of more vulnerable populations, and there's a hard split in the Black community out that way, especially so you got like the very wealthy and educated, and then you got everybody else. So I'm trying to figure out how, because most of the time if we do like a business workshop or something like that, it's the already educated people who are showing up. And it's like, no, I need to teach the more vulnerable populations how to answer questions when they go to Planned Parenthood, how to get that stuff done properly when they're getting their insurance and things like that. And so trying to figure out how to, one, market the idea of this stuff, then get them in there, and then transfer the information to people who might not normally run it. So I just wanted to know, like, if you had any ideas, if you guys were working on anything like that.
Yeah, we can talk more kind of during offline or whatever too, but even in general, that's why I always like use my personal story and I connect it to that, because algorithms, all this stuff is so nebulous and it's all like Black Mirror and Mr. Robot. It can get really wild. But when I talk about my personal story, like, it's kind of like a crazy, like, kind of traumatizing story, but, like, it's so important because that, it lands for people, right? Especially people who've had, honestly, unfortunately, many people have had similar experiences like that, right? Especially in our communities. So, using storytelling, we've gotten so creative. So, for example, for our data code of ethics, kind of, instead of us having, like, a workshop with, like, note takers and all this other stuff, we actually made, like, a installation at the last conference where how we were going to get information on what kind of ethical questions, like, people were thinking about in terms of algorithms and other stuff. We literally made a cube installation where on the inside we wrote the words we commit. So, like, what do people commit to? And on the outside we wrote we demand. And I can share out the article about the researcher that helped us come up with it and the artist that built it. But that was the best way for us to kind of have this conversation on ethics without making it this, like, high level. Like, I didn't go high level, like, jargony too, but, like, how useful is that for folks who don't, So, and other ways, like, we're thinking about this algorithm labeling project. We're like, okay, do we want to make it like nutrition labels? That has its own political history. That's a whole other talk. But, like, what would it look like to have, like, an app or PSA or whatever, like, so that people can actually, be able to come across it and, and understand. And I think, too, it sounds like you're already doing this. Part of our work is going where decision makers are, like, going to Congress, but it's also going where the people are. Like, that whole St. Paul campaign, we didn't have funding. Like we were supporting them with funding. Like, we weren't getting paid to go. Like, that was intentional. Like, I was turning down a whole bunch of other opportunities that could have actually been lucrative and profitable for our organization to do this, because that's where our commitment was. And that came from, like, a real values decision. Are we going to support the work of folks who, within their own, communities are so, like, silenced and unheard, or are we going to go and continue to, like, do talks in San Francisco, So, and I haven't been to like one time this year, and I live on the West Coast now, but that's intentional, right? I'm going to Minneapolis. I'm going to Houston, Texas, right? I'm in Arizona on the reservation, working with folks who are thinking about data sovereignty. Like, I'm in rural Chiapas, Mexico, right? I'm going to Eastern Europe, right? Because these are the places where we need to be actually engaging with people. But that, again, takes, like, a whole values and, like, a commitment thing, too. So that's a theme as well. I do believe that in the age of big data, we have to be more human. We have to lead into more humanness, empathy, love, and all that other stuff, too. So.
Sure, yeah. We have a few coming in. So starting maybe a little bit with the flip side about communicating with communities. In your experience working with local communities, what types of arguments are policymakers?
I mean, it's amazing how the conversation changes once we have our own data, right? I mean, in terms of what arguments, I mean, that's an interesting question. So, in terms of arguments, right? Let me see. One thing I found is that, like, for the people in St. Paul, or even honestly some people internally at Facebook, some people, not everybody, not everybody really has, like they're not evil, they're not necessarily malicious. Maybe they're definitely living in a bubble where they're not in contact with any of the people that their work is even impacting. But I think, like, what we're able to do, not just using our own data and having our own information to kind of press the point and to sometimes shame and to make demands, but to really, like, see folks as individuals and kind of connect with them in that way as well, right? And understand where they're coming from, right? And I think that's why we've been kind of successful in this approach. I mean, when we were doing work in Miami, it was very clear that they were not trying to listen to us, that they were not trying to hear us, and we needed these other levels and this kind of other strategy in addition to the data, like shaming. We always need direct action. I believe in direct action. I believe in protest. I believe in shutting stuff down as well. That can usually sometimes help make a clear point as well. But, like, at least around this tech policy and all these, like, emerging things in terms of the way big data is being used, like, we're at a place where people don't, again, know. Like, so how do we take this as a chance to shame, to push back and to challenge, but also to educate? So, and that means using data, but really, again, using people's real stories, right? You can't deny that. So hopefully I answered that question, but.
This next one's a two-parter. We had sort of related to that first question. Data, where's the line between advocacy and good intent and privacy?
Yes, great
and
question.
Similarly, what recommendations are there for working with data that could be used to improve the health and lives of vulnerable populations? Use forcibly identify, exploit, or further marginalize.
Great question. So the first was the line between privacy and advocacy. Yeah. So, I think like a lot of times, we have this conversation internally around, we live in a country, there's people often like associate like surveillance with like security, but like we need safety, right? And I think in the case of what we were dealing with in Miami, we weren't thinking of like, we didn't have the language around privacy, but we were definitely thinking about that, right? Like what it meant for us to collect our own data and to kind of protect that, but also what are the ways being very intentional that we were sharing it, right? Like, and maybe privacy for us meant making it in a format that only other young people could understand, which was a comic book. Well, everybody could read a comic book, but making it in that format intentionally, right? Sure, and that was the same format that we were giving to decision makers. But, I think this question around privacy is really important. It's something that we have a lot, where obviously, being activists, being community groups, we're constantly under the threat of surveillance. And we all use Google Docs. We all use these kind of technological tools. I've been through a million kind of security training. I myself has been under surveillance for some of the activities I've done. So, but again, I think there is a difference. There is a difference when we have control over our own data. There is a difference when we have the tools, whether it's collection tools, whether it's our own methods of storing it, our own methods of disseminating it, where it's in our hands and we own it, right? And I think, I wish I could think of some more examples of how people are really dealing with it. I think folks should really look towards our Data Bodies project. One of the folks on the panel that I pointed out, Tamika Lewis, they think about this a lot in Detroit, actually. So please, there's actually a new resource book that they just released from our Data Bodies project. And I would love whoever asked that question for them to refer to that, because there's so much kind of guidelines that those folks have laid out on how to do that data collection and how to do that activism and not have it being used to recriminalize. So that's my answer to the first question. What was the second question again?
The second question was just broader. What recommendations for working with data that could simultaneously the health and lives of or misuse, identify, exploit, or further market?
Yes. So I think for me, the first thing I think about is just like the whole like data science process and like research process, right? I think even before we think about data collection always comes from like what kind of questions we're asking, and I think if we're at like, I was reading an article right before I got here, probably written by somebody who's part of this institute, where they talked about absolutely we need more data on sexual and gender minorities, but we also need to have better questions that inform that data collection, right? And I know you guys are probably going to go into it, but, I think a lot of people like to get to the math really quick. And before we get to the math, we have to do the work of thinking about the ethics, the values. What are we optimizing? What does success look like, right? Before we think about like what kind of data needs to be collected, and I think that informs, of course, like how it's being used. So might not be the best answer to the question, and I'm sure somebody else can answer it. Well, actually, you could probably respond to that tweet really well. You could probably respond, Dylan. But that's the first thing that comes to my mind, right? Like I think about the whole data science process as being very holistic, just like our lives, right? Like what are we optimizing? What is success? And then what are our questions, right? How do we embed our own values? I love this ethos of justice perspective, right? We were asking different questions around infant mortality and people who give birth than any other agency was, right? We were asking them for the purpose of holding institutions and hospitals accountable, but also providing education. While we were also fighting, the hospital, we were also finding ways to connect people to midwifery services, right? To prenatal care, to alternatives to that system. because we saw that like it was just so urgent, you know. And I think that's what we used the data to sway decision makers, but we were also using it, you know, again to like actually save lives. So, anybody else who can answer that, please?
I'll sit on this. We come back, let's do a little bit of a break, okay? What we're gonna do is we're gonna pause. We went over a little bit, but the conversation was so good. So we're gonna do like a 15-minute break.
Yes.
I know, it's hot in here. We'll open the doors, we'll air it out. We have some coffee. Feel free to go to the bathroom. Bathrooms are in the center of the floor. Just follow the signs all the way around. Yeah, I think that's about it.
I had a question, but I'm going to insert myself anyway. First of all, thank you. I will say a quote to you: "Vocal cannot be ignored," which I won't either, but silence can be. So I congratulate you and give you your honor and praise for not being silent. What you are doing for the people, more so for Black people and Black leadership, is unfounded and it definitely will be replicated. I will be at your conference. I will support you. Right? I will be a part of what it is you're doing. What I would like for you to talk about is Black leadership in a place that don't want to see us. All of these people walking around here, we still hashtag so white, so privileged, and Black people are still pushed back even with degrees. I have equivalents of PhDs and I still can't be moved. What I want you to say to the audience that's sitting in here, because there's only like 5 of us here that are Black, is where are we with our leadership and why can't we be the ones doing the work?
That's real. I think that's a question that I grapple with and I deal with on a daily basis, right? And I think, you know, in all the different campaigns, I talked about campaigns, I talked about policy, I talked about all these cool ways we're using data. The biggest basis of our work is leadership development, right? If you look at the people who are on this big data thing, St. Paul, even if you think about the people who are leading this algorithmic labeling work, we're very intentional about investing in nurturing leadership for people who are not seen as leaders, right? There's a reason why the people at our conference look the way they do, because that's going against not just, you know, who we traditionally see as leaders, but also this kind of like politics of desirability too, right? That I think most of our even social justice leaders, you know, look a certain way, right? Who do we really privilege? Who do we really see as being like a viable, qualified voice to speak on these issues, right? And I think, you know, I only have control over, again, the work that I do, but that's a value, right? All the success we've been able to have, sure, it's because we have great strategy. Yes, it's because we have good ideas, but it's because we actually invest in people's leadership. And the people who are really carrying out this work, yes, I'm inspiring, I'm putting a battery in their back, but it's me recognizing and seeing, just like how somebody saw something in me. I'm the product of leadership development. Somebody saw that, you know what, this girl, there's something in her that we need to nourish, and we need to really, really, really push. And we're going to send her to trainings. We're going to give her opportunities to learn about data. We're going to give her opportunities to more responsibilities to be a leader. And that's the way of me really paying it forward, right? So, you know, anybody who's welcome in our movement, please come and join. And I think especially people who feel like, whether it's here at their institution, whether it's here in their city, you do not have leadership opportunities. This is a space. This is why we created not just an organization, not just a network, but a movement, a leaderful movement, right? And I think specifically, this is why you go to our conference, 90% of the speakers are people of color, over 80% are Black, right? Because we do not, especially on tech issues, we're absent, right? Even the folks who are coming up with the research, making decisions, we're absent, right? So, you know, that's a great question, and I think, you know, hopefully we can continue to talk about that as well. But, you know, again, it comes from intentions and it comes from value, but also it comes from me, my real experiences of being dismissed, being not seen as a leader, and being kind of ignored, right? So thank you for that, for what you said.
We're going to shift a little bit. So first of all, I just wanted to check in real quick, just real quick. Any thoughts so far? Any group check-in? How are things going? Feedback? Is the psychologist in me? Yeah.
I had a thought about how we talked a lot about the profit motive here Chapter and how we're butting up against massive institutions and organizations that are looking for money, and how capitalism has infected a lot of science. And it makes me think about our own process at retaining our own integrity as people who intend to be in positions of power. How do we protect ourselves from those kinds of influences? How do we protect ourselves from our darker sides?
Yeah. Just that.
Yeah.
It's a really good question. I don't know if anybody has like responses to it. So basically, like, how capitalism has infected all parts of us, of the research we do. How do we keep ourselves ethical? How do we protect ourselves from our darker sides? Did I?
More comment than a question, but
Yeah. And it's so I think it's such an important question though, because at an individual level in so many areas, people are trying to be good people and just like they're doing what's best for them and the people around them and best for themselves on a day-to-day basis. But in context, bad decisions, like impact other people and reverberate through the system. And so I don't have the answer to that. That's something I personally struggle with quite a bit. Yeah.
I was just thinking that, and one thing that she had said earlier too about people at Facebook, they're not evil people, and I was like, really? Are you sure? But then you mentioned that they live in a bubble, and so I think what's important is to stay connected to your community, and then also listen to people who are voices for those communities that aren't necessarily in big data or in the work or necessarily in like the education field or whatever. Just make sure that you listen to people's lived and check in with it often.
Yes, and I feel like this also kind of plays in that whole, everybody's in their own sort of bubble, and we're so disconnected on a day-to-day basis, and social media just like insulates you in your old world view.
Yeah,
all of us. I'll go here. To you.
Along with that, accountability. I feel like accountability. And who are we accountable to? Or are we accountable to the clients? Just, I think, keeping that in mind. Like Birkett, we've also horizontally, having accountability in our own borders.
It's funny, like in some of the examples, when the goal of some technological system is to save somebody money, the result is so much different than if it's like to prevent abuse or to save somebody's life. It's so different what that system's going to look like.
So, to that point with academics, I think one of the risks is that if you get into an entire building, and as the scale increases, I think people have a tendency to become more and more entitled. Not to listen to others. Facebook, Google have a lot of that. They became so big, so successful, so they actually think that they have the solution to everything and that we should all listen to them. But I think academics sometimes there is too much money on too few hands, and those people stop listening to anyone and the richness of the diversity. I think that's something that people can do, and they are approaching entire size. They could step back.
And I think that that's really important what you said, though. I think as academics sometimes, like, and this is perspective as somebody who is an academic, and like I'm in a research institute, like it's hard, and we constantly feel like we are, trying to fund ourselves and trying to make ends meet and trying to scramble all the time, and you're working all the time. But at the same time, you also have a lot of power and you have a lot of authority. And you can't forget that. Even though on a day-to-day basis it feels hard, there's a lot of privilege that you're given in that position too. Okay, so I'm going to pause. I think we can go a little bit more, but I'm going to pause just to make sure we get to our speakers, and there'll be lots of conversation through the day. I wanted to kind of switch the conversation now into sexual and gender minority populations. Let me pull up my notes. So, so much of the work that's being done, as Yoshi was saying, there's been a little bit of a gap here when it comes to sexual and gender minority folks being involved in these conversations. And I think part of that, I feel like, I'm surrounded by folks who are doing this research, and it's wonderful. This institute is fabulous. But I think we have a lot to learn too, as well, of like, the similarities and differences between when we're talking about racial minorities and other marginalized populations. It looks different, and it functions differently than sexual and gender minorities, and trying to understand like what are the similarities and differences between race and sexual orientation, because what we're frequently trying to do is get more visibility, which might be very different. And I think both race and sexual orientation, minority groups in the U.S. And also obviously targets of prejudice, as well as having huge health inequities. And for sure, like, prejudice leads to bad treatment at the hands of some majority. But I think there's a lot of differences, though, too. United States, major differences in history. Race is embedded in racism and slavery, and that continues to impact Black and brown populations on a day-to-day basis in serious ways that don't impact sexual and gender minorities. And so, for example, while both populations, experience greater rates of poverty, race is even more tied to socioeconomic status, and we can't disentangle that. But I think there's also something here about there's differences with race being like this visible attribute that like people don't have a choice whether or not they're able to disclose. But I feel like there's something with sexual orientation and gender identity where there's a little bit more privilege in terms of disclosure or in terms of the identity or how central you're making that. And I think that with that privilege of being able to conceal, we can't ignore that. Like, that is absolutely a privilege. I don't really know where I'm going with that, but I think it's just, but I think it's something that like I've been trying to think of and grapple with, because what a lot of what we talk about is how to get more data, how to get into data sets. Absolutely important, but I'm also worried about like, well, what happens once we're there, and then. Like, then we're going to be dealing with maybe a lot of negative consequences that other groups have dealt with in the past. And so, it's a privilege to have your problem be, we're not in the data. So on that note, I want to introduce Gregory Phillips. Let me give a lovely little intro to him again. So Gregory Phillips, he's an assistant professor in the Department of Medical Social Sciences. He directs the research program in evaluation, data integration, and technical assistance, EDIT, within ISGM. His research focuses on understanding social, sexual, and network level factors that drive the HIV epidemic among men of sex with men, particularly around young MSM and Black MSM. He received his doctorate in epidemiology from George Washington University in 2012 and has spent the last decade working on HRSA, CDC, NIH-funded projects focused on identifying behaviors associated with HIV infection. He's the PI of 2 NIH-funded R01s, an NIAAA-funded project assessing the role of alcohol disparities and HIV risk among sexual minority youth, utilizing data from the CDC's Youth Risk Behavior Survey, and Network Canvas, which we talked about earlier, a NIDA-funded project to develop a standalone software suite that will simplify the process of collecting complex network and geospatial data. And he's really just leading our community engagement at the Institute. He's just so good at it, and he really values it. And so I'm going to turn it over to Gregory now.
Well, thank you, Michelle. I'm actually not going to get so much into the community engaged piece of this. I'm saving that for Lauren's talk, but I think, as we've heard throughout the day from Yeshi and others, community engagement is such a big piece. Having the voices of people who represent the community involved in the work is so key to anything we do. And like, I feel a personal connection to this. I'm a gay man. I'm really passionate about this research because it affects me and my community. So I'm going to give just some overview of what sex, sexual orientation, gender identity is for the people in the room who may not know all the different aspects of it. what data is out there, some good, bad things that have been done, and how we can actually do some good things with what's been collected, even if it's not the greatest.